Thank you very much. It's a total pleasure being here. It's a beautiful room and a great audience, so it's absolutely my pleasure to discuss these issues. The presentation today is going to be based on a paper. That's a paper that I've written about a year ago. It's called the Global Housing Affordability Crisis, where I discuss policy, strategies, and options. If you want to download the paper and suffer through 50 pages of very detailed housing policy, global housing policy, you feel free to do that. My name is Albert Saiz. I'm the Daniel Rose Associate Professor of Urban Economics and Real Estate at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. It's my pleasure to talk to you about these issues, which are obviously global issues. No matter where I go, no matter which country I go, even developing countries, they're experiencing very similar issues to the ones that you experience here. So it's not just a Danish problem, it's a global problem. So we see housing prices increasing, especially in urban areas, in the most dynamic urban areas that are concentrating increasingly economic activities. So we've seen housing prices increasing. We got a bit of a lull during the global financial depression and then come back up from 2010 on. Now, we didn't have as big of a lull during this last COVID recession. As a matter of fact, you could argue the opposite, that people were buying homes, even despite the recession. Denmark is unfortunately one of the countries that suffered, as many others. Here you look at the top countries from 1995 to 2020. And you've seen that phenomenon. As we've seen it in Massachusetts, we've seen it in Barcelona, we've seen it in New York, we've seen it in Shanghai, we've seen it in Beijing, we've seen it in Manila. So you're in good company that way. Why? Why do we have this housing crisis? Wherever I go, I tend to see people coming up with local explanations. So in the United States, people talk a lot about the specific policies, housing policies, and ownership policies. But once you look at this as a global problem, you really change your way to think about it. It's got to be a global answer to the question of why we have housing prices going up everywhere at the same time. And I come up with at least 5 explanations. There's probably even more. But these are certainly global. Globally, we have increased income inequality. That's true even in countries such as yours, where you have a relatively generous welfare state. But we've seen the incomes of highly skilled people more tied with incomes and their fortunes really more tied to international trade and export technology rising, whereas like people who are in agricultural sectors or in the industry, especially in the West, their incomes are either stagnating or going up slightly only above inflation. So that's going to generate, if you have like differences in the quality of housing, that's going to generate a flight from the rich towards the highly desirable areas. The second issue that receives much, much less attention, and I think it should be received much more, is what we call the cost disease. There was a French economist, Baumol, who came up with this idea. And it's a fantastic idea that the manufacturing sector, so if you look at this thing that I'm holding here, the productivity for producing these things is really increasing. Not only because we have more machines and better technology, but because we're also outsourcing this. This is produced by Foxconn in China. And because of the combination of technology and the fact that this is produced in very low wage countries, the cost of these kinds of things is decreasing, which means that the relative change in the cost structure is such that housing is produced locally with local wages, local materials, and the productivity of the housing sector is not growing at the same level, plus the land where we stand, that's really definitely not produced. So the productivity growth there is absolutely zero. So the combination of these very large growth in productivity in manufactured tradables, combined with the fact that we have something that's produced locally and the productivity is not increasing, means that in relative terms, the prices of housing should actually go up relative to other things. So when we're thinking about using, say, a 30% share of income spent on housing, we have to think about whether that's reasonable anymore, because these things we produce and they're relatively cheaper to our incomes, but the land and the structure are produced with lower productivity. Maybe we now need a 35 or 40% of our income devoted to housing. The fourth explanation, and Mr. John was actually exposing this very appropriately, is that we have this winner-takes-all economy. It's a few cities, in Europe, you could argue that's one or two in every country that are actually concentrated economic activity. We're going to decide later whether this is good or bad. I'm going to talk about this, but this is a fact, okay? So I'm going to take this as a fact, and realizing that you have this economic activity concentrated in a few cities, therefore you're going to see housing prices growing there. Fourth, not in my backyard, anti-development pressures. And again, I'm really, really surprised every time that I travel that I see the reincarnation of the same phenomenon everywhere you see. It takes a slightly different tackle. It takes a slightly different accent in each country, but it's always the same. We don't like real estate development. We just don't like real estate development. Unfortunately, in some countries, they don't like real estate developers either, and that's a problem. So we're not developing as much as we should because we don't like development, and therefore the housing, the supply is not growing commensurately with that demand growth. And finally, a fifth factor, also commensurate with the growth of China and the East, is that we have a relative global savings glut. Then people argue for and against this hypothesis. I think it's very clear that what we've seen over the last 30 years, it's a growth in the number of countries that are exporting much more than they are importing, and therefore they really need to place the capital that they get, the dollars that they get, the euros that they get in the capital markets, and that's depressing the cost of capital globally, and therefore mortgage rates went down. They come back up, and we can talk about this, but the prices seem, at least in the United States, to be staying put. So these are the problems. Now, obviously, maybe even 15 years ago, you could argue, well, housing markets don't overregulate, don't touch them so much. I don't think that you can make this argument any longer, not even in the US, which is a much more market-oriented policy arena. So we need housing policy. We clearly need active housing policy. The issue is which kind of housing policy. And then you start thinking about a problem that I see also when I talk to policymakers, that they have very, very different and oftentimes conflicting objectives when undertaking housing policies. So we need to do housing policy, but we all need to agree first on what are the objectives and how we're trading off the objectives. So the more explicit you can be about it, the better off in terms of the outcomes that you're going to get. So what are the objectives that I see that people throw out in terms of the discussion? First objective, affordable housing versus income mixing. This is also here, very clearly. We can have cheap housing, but if all poor people or people from specific ethnicities that don't have the same level to local resources are concentrated in a few areas, that is a problem. Okay, so we have two. Now it reveals that we really did have two objectives: affordable housing and mixing people with different incomes, which is fine, but you got to understand those two. Site quality, same with regards to site quality. Even if you have a relatively homogeneous population, you definitely don't want to be building housing that's affordable very far away in the suburban areas that are 20 kilometers away from the downtown. So that's especially true and very related to your policy discussions about transportation. And in the 60s and 70s, you're really strong on that combination of housing and transportation. You're leaders there, so you know very well what I mean by quality of the sites in terms of accessibility. But some other countries haven't been as the foresight in other countries hasn't been as good as yours. Third kind of discussion here, affordable housing versus local economic development. That I see over and over, especially from the congressmen in the US, because they really want to bring bacon to their own districts. And they're really thinking of these affordable housing dollars as coming to the district and hitting the district for economic development purposes. So they're not thinking, the reality is though, is that someone who lives in your district might want to move somewhere else in the future. Okay, so those dollars might be portable. That's not the way sometimes the policymakers look at this. So they're really confusing or confounding rather the affordable housing objective with local development. Very different type of animals. You gotta be careful with those two and separating. The fourth, and I'm sad to say, increasingly larger divide in terms of policy confusion or confounding is the issue of affordability versus ideology. Okay, unfortunately, we've seen a growth, and that's no one is to blame, but no one is escaping this phenomenon either, which is like we're making this into an ideological issue, and sometimes again, we're and I'm going to discuss this a little bit later. But again, we're calling names, so you're doing this, you're such and such and such. And that's not productive for affordable housing policy. Affordable housing policy requires a degree of consensus and stability. You cannot change housing policy every 4 years. It's not feasible because housing is going to be there for the next 50 to 100 years. You cannot be just changing the rules of the market every 4 years. And therefore, ideology, whereas it's great at home, maybe it's not great when you have these consensuses about housing policy. Fourth, working class versus bottom of the pyramid. Some people do really want to focus on the working class and sort of like policemen, firemen, teachers, so on and so forth, because these people are not being able to afford the best locations in the city. Some other people are really going to want to focus on the sort of the really destitute, people homeless, the people who have really nothing to go by. These are conflicting to a degree, especially true if you have a fixed amount of dollars or euros or kronen to actually spend on housing policy. Because if, say, you focus on the bottom of the pyramid, and for instance, these are ethnically different people, a lot of your funding is going to go to these different populations, and that can generate ethnic tensions in the local. And you see, again, it's in different flavors. You see this going on in different countries, but it's always the same kind of issue. Affordability versus the human right to expensive cities. Now the issue is also like we have super large number of activists in the U.S. They're it's almost a running joke that they're almost all in the Northeast, in New York, Massachusetts, and California, which is the most expensive areas. And then you have to ask yourself, is it a human right to live in New York City? Is it a human right? Maybe it is, I don't know, you guys tell me. But if it is, well, it's a very different discussion, no? But obviously you have the push for policy. It's larger in these places where maybe that's not where you want to put all your eggs in that basket. So all of these, I don't have good answers for you. I'm sorry. I apologize. But I can tell you that at the very least, in the discussion, you should make those all explicit. And remember Tim Burgeon's rule. Tim Burgeon was a planner / economist in the 40s and 50s who came up with this idea. If you have a number of policy objectives, you have to have a commensurate number of policy levers or ways to affect policy. So you have 5 objectives, I need 5 policies, or 5 different policies. If I just use one policy to try to do both, I'm not going to get anyone satisfied. So, now, let's go. We agreed, okay, now we had this discussion, we agreed on our objectives, so now let's look at what the tools we can use to do housing policy. No? And then the tools, I'm going to go very quickly through them, but I can categorize these tools in a number of dimensions that if you dig deeper, all housing policies do tend to have these dimensions associated with them. One is local versus national. I think economists, especially US economists, for local reasons, but I think it's because again the problems are so similar, I think that this is the right conclusion. We're trying to move the discussion towards the local arena. Okay, so should we ask them the Danish government to provide affordable housing? Well, yes, but maybe we also need to ask the mayor of Copenhagen to provide affordable housing. So affordable housing starts from the local level. Now, this is very related to the second kind of discussion, which is, do we have demand policies or supply policies? Should we incentivize construction? Should you incentivize, should we subsidize demand? They're both important. There's no way around the fact that you need to do both. But perhaps the emphasis has been historically so much on the demand that we're now coming very strongly on maybe the need to think much more about supply, providing land and facilitating construction, both technologically and sort of from a factory or productivity point of view. Cannot neglect the supply side. Ownership versus owning versus renting, that's also the very important dimension that you tend to see in all housing policies around the world. And again, I'm excited about that, but perhaps less excited than some people. I think we need to think more about paths rather than either rental housing, or ownership. We need to think about paths that people can move through, sort of maybe renting from 22 to 30 and then owning and then maybe renting again. Why not? After 63 or 64. Okay, so I think we have to rethink policy in terms of paths, which already is going to get you into a more portable kind of benefit sort of mentality. Excuse me. Public versus private sector. This is almost a consensus globally. If you're a municipality and you're providing public housing, you're one tweet away from disaster. Okay? If the water mains are not working, there's no hot water, that's immediate a political crisis for whoever's providing public housing. So we've seen with this increase, sort of like in a way, with this increased constant complaining that comes from like media that's 24/7, I think that we've seen is less of an appetite for local governments to actually manage public housing. Because you're a manager, no one loves their landlord, let me tell you. De jure versus de facto, that's mostly for developing countries. I've been talking to the Colombian Ministry of Housing. And obviously there, what you have in the box it's not necessarily what's going on. And finally, not all housing policy is budgetary. No, we tend to, and for a good reason. No, budget fights are political fights. No, and obviously you want to have a budget if you're a housing minister. Absolutely understood and respected. However, there's a lot of policies that are more regulatory, that are enabling, that have to do with land, and what you do with land that also matters. So you gotta both think about budget and concurrently think about these kind of other policies. Okay, so let me go to a topic that I really come very strong on in the paper. If you read the paper, I really go very strong on this one, which is targeting versus broad entitlements. I do tend to have a preference for targeting housing benefits. Why is that? Broad entitlements are great. So we all have the right to housing in the constitutions of many countries, which is great. But the reality is that whereas broad benefits, having everyone have access to benefit, can cement social cohesion. So it's a good idea. In housing, it's turning out to be a bit problematic in many of our countries. Because for one, housing is not portable. So if you give a housing unit, that's going to stay there for a long time, okay, as opposed to getting a check or a subsidy or education. And as you give an entitlement, that might reduce mobility. So it's not only that the housing is going to be there, but the people are going to stay there also if you do give housing benefits very broadly. And again, the third kind of problem is right now, because housing is becoming so expensive, whereas in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we could provide these sort of subsidies. Like think about the British housing authorities and all the public housing that they offer in the 60s and 70s. It's now impossible, given the budgetary requirements that they must have to provide them as much housing as they provided in the 60s and 70s, because of the price of housing is, in relative terms to the economy, remember, it's actually growing very much. So all of these generate this cleavage between two generations. I'm going to show you This is like how economists think about the world. And so we have 1994, a city is a circular city. Everyone lives around the center. That's the center. And everyone is more or less the same. Let's assume that everyone has a housing entitlement. Fast forward to 2024, the city's grown. And now you have the older people who get access to these housing units. And that's true in a pure market society. Have now, because of the preference for living here, now these places are becoming much more expensive. These places are marginal, they're farther away, people have to commute an hour, they have 2 kids, they have to leave jobs behind. So the younger people here, just because of that natural growth in population around the cities, a few cities, the younger people are housing poor. And that inequality is actually growing worse. No? So, I mean, it's very clear in the US, but I think it's true everywhere, where you see the older people are actually now owning the homes and they're relatively wealthier. Whereas for you, as you're a 21-year-old, you're really housing short. Now, in some countries, the entitlements might actually make these worse because people here, they have the best location. Why would they move? No? What's the incentive? You have access to great location. So that actually exacerbates that inequality. In a market situation, that would be already a problem, which we have in the US. But at the very least, you can dream about getting rich and buying a home. But if people are here on entitlement basis, there's no dream. It's impossible. Okay? So that's generating, I think, a real big cleavage across generations. That's a problem we have to deal with. And then you go thinking, maybe if the subsidy followed the person up to 35, when I don't have so much money, I get a bit of subsidy. And then it's personal, it moves with me, and then it goes down a little bit as I get older and richer. Maybe that might have been a better idea, or that could be a better idea. Okay? In places where we have, or even cities, no, it's that local. It can be a city like Brighton, the UK. You have these public housing authorities. And, in places where you have these entitlements, again, because of the fact that housing is much more expensive, you do tend to see problems with waiting lists, okay? Because you cannot offer the same that you used to offer, which creates cynicism among the youth. Again, it exacerbates that political imbalance between the generations. If you do have a little bit of means testing, so I'm advocating for means testing, meaning that you just give the benefits to whoever needs them. But if you do retain a little bit of means testing capabilities, then unfortunately the poor, say, immigrants or ethnic minorities are going to overqualify because they're at the bottom of the bottom, and that creates even second kind of like not only old versus young, but it generates also them versus us dynamics that, I lived here forever, my parents lived here, I don't have access to this, okay? So targeting seems like better, on retrospect. Now, got to talk about housing policy instruments, but really not, because there's so many. I came up with 30 housing policy instruments, and again, they're not in isolation, you can combine them. So I counted 2 to the power of 30 combinations of housing policies that you can do. Please do read the paper. I'm going to go very quickly and underline a few of them, because I want to talk a bit about the topic that's at hand today too. So number one, I think economists all agree, the consensus is that you have to eliminate regulatory barriers against housing construction. We need to build, build, build. I know, build, baby, build, it sounds regressive. I understand it. I accepted that role that sort of like academic natures bestowed upon me, but I have to be that bad guy, okay? Build, 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 baby, build. Facilitate filtering. Any building is a good housing policy. Any building is affordable housing policy, even if it's a high-income building. Why is that? Because by building a high-income building, that person who's going to move into the high-income building is not going to have to displace someone else from a middle-income neighborhood. And that middle-income neighborhood who's not displaced now doesn't have in turn to displace someone else from low-income housing. So the housing market is completely connected. If I move here, I'm not there anymore. Okay? People look focus so much about, oh, I'm moving here, how privileged I am, but I also left that space free for other people. Any housing is better than none. Cross-collateralization and risk reduction. That's very important, I think, especially in the US environment where we're talking about a lot of eviction and avoiding eviction. And obviously, we have to avoid eviction. It's not like, it's not like, we're gleefully liking when someone is evicted. No, it's actually something we want to avoid, we need to avoid. There's ways to avoid them that are perhaps better, like an insurance program. So that now there's a lot of talk in the US about a housing reinsurance program where, and there's actually products, that's an example in Colombia, where if you're a landlord, you can actually buy us insurance against default from your renter. The private market can do some, but I think this has to be public. You need a public reinsurance default, whereas if you're a landlord and I have a probability that they're not going to pay the poor person who cannot afford to live there cannot pay, there's an insurance that's associated with that problem. Okay, and you know what? That can be made progressive because I can charge the relatively high income or high rental level sort of contracts a higher rate to reinsure that risk. So rather than freezing the evictions, which is what we're doing in the US, well, that's associated with, you know what? There's no landlords in many cities. Now, you're going to see that like in some cities that introduce these anti-landlord policies, what do you get is no landlords, no? So that's not what we want, obviously. Increasing occupation density of current stock. Let me show you, and I do that because this is a student of mine, but also because I like the idea. So this student of mine started up this company, this new company. It's a website-based company. It's a prop tech company. It's called Nesterly. And what she does is, we have a problem in many cities in the US, go back to the wealth between the young and the old. It's not only that you have that wealth difference, but also the fact that the old in the US tend to live in 4 to 5 bedrooms homes, and they want to age in place, which I absolutely respect that. You want to age where you raise your kids, and that's the place where you have your social contacts. Fair enough. But unfortunately, in some cases, you have one person living in a building. Really, it's a house with 4, 5 empty spaces. Okay, so that's actually creating a bit of a cleavage in the Boston area. I think 30% of family homes, quote unquote, that could be used for 3 to 4 people with 2, 3, 4 kids, are occupied by people who live 1 or 2 on the house. So that creates a market. This is an exchange where elderly people can actually post their rooms to actually rent to young people, students. In Boston, we have a big population of students. So that's a win-win. The elderly person gets some company. The rent can be discounted if the young person does some work in the house. Okay, so rather than paying $1,500 or $1,700, I'm going to pay $900, but I have to help you do the chores every other week. Okay, so that's a way to reactivate space that we have and that we don't know, that we don't realize we have. So densification, re-densification, reutilization of the space. Another example here is with the accessory units. The Canadians started that, but the Americans are now all about it. California, we just did it in Boston, and which is like allowed to build smaller accessory units. This is about like 500 square feet. It's about 50 square meters. Okay, but this unit has everything that you need for a young couple or a young person who's a student. It's on the backyard, literally on the backyard. So this is truly, yes, in my backyard. And the person who actually bought the unit, that built the unit, has to, it's actually able to collect the rent on this. In Boston, we're trying to implement this. We have a bit of a problem, though. The construction costs of these units are just too large for reasons that I'm not going to go into. Improving low-quality stock. Again, not everything needs to be new. And increase urban space in greenfields. We don't necessarily need very large roads and streets. You can build, and especially, for instance, in the southwest of the US, in Arizona, you actually would like to build buildings closer apart because they provide shade to one another. So why do we need like 10-meter streets if we can get away with 5-meter, maybe have one direction for the cars? And finally, a couple of things I want to talk about. One of them is really non-profit or triple bottom line entrepreneurship. So I'm a big advocate, and we have a little bit of that in our school. I'm at the School of Architecture and Planning, and we do have a DesignX, which is an incubator to actually generate ideas for design, architecture, and real estate development. So I'm a fan of that model, and I think we need, each university should have an affordable housing entrepreneurship incubator. If you don't have one, get one at home. And the idea is, this is a friend of mine who's the developer in Panama. Panama is actually, the development level, it's pretty high. I mean, it's not, this is really amazing. It looks like Hong Kong if you go there, like the types of buildings. But what he's been doing is redeveloping Casco Viejo, which is the downtown, which was completely obliterated because you had a lot of social problems like gangs. And what he did is he co-opted the gang leaders into working with him and starting businesses. So you have now, and I enjoyed this actually, they have gang tours of downtown Panama. You can go there, they feed you, you can eat, they have their restaurants. So they incorporated these quote unquote problematic agents in society into a business model. So this is an entrepreneur who does believe in doing good financially, but doing well, I'm sorry, financially, but doing good also for society, so incorporating these externalities of development. I'm very worried about this because in only 5 or 6 years, I've seen activism from both sides, not necessarily just one side. Being this person, it's very difficult. Being my friend is getting harder and harder because I feel, at least in the US, that there's been a lot of anti-developer rhetoric, anti-landlord rhetoric. It's almost like them versus us, coming back. You saw that in the 20s and 30s, unfortunately. So you're starting to see that. I'm not saying that developers are all nice, and they're not necessarily. The problem, though, is that if you don't create an environment where being a developer can be socially acceptable, you have a clear path for a socially impactful development, then the only people who are going to go into the industry are the people who are not necessarily that nice. If you're going to be insulted, if you're going to be opposed, if you're going to be, constantly derided, you might as well. No nice person will survive that environment. Okay, so I think we're creating an environment where we're generating what we're decrying, by claiming that developers are awful. We're just getting awful people into the industry because no one nice, sane person would go unless we create a path. Very important to really, really, really create a pro-development ideology and a pro-development, pro-real estate development that's got this socially conscious environment. Okay, and that's very important for the left, which right now is not doing that at all. Okay, large projects. Economists, again, we're Mr. Scrooge, as you can already tell from the from the tenor of the conversation. So we do tend to be for large-scale developments. Why is that? Well, if you can produce 40,000 units, in one tack, so that's 80,000 people living there, 2.5 per house, so that's more. 90,000 people, 110, whatever. My math on public is not great. Multiply 2.5 by 40,000 and you see a lot of people being housed. Okay, so this can be done in a right way. There's a right way, however, there's a lot of bad ways to do this too. And we've seen a lot of white elephants that are built by sort of government without any checks and balances from a social or political perspective. Obviously, I'm not advocating for those. So it's a good way, and I'm very specific in the paper about the right ways to go about this. But I think there's a right way to go about this. It's got to involve massive upzoning. So create a lot of new development rights that didn't used to be there. It's got to be mostly financed privately. If you have like the government or the politicians dominating this, it's probably it smells like a white elephant. It's got to respect civil liberties, which in many of these developments, unfortunately, I'm thinking of Mozambique, for instance, a large city outside Angola, as a matter of fact, the large city outside of the capital, Luanda, just pushed there by politicians, publicly subsidized by everyone, and there's no demand. It's got to be economically viable, so jobs have to be available. That's what they learn in China in many of these smaller 2- and 3rd-tier cities. And very importantly, you got to cross-subsidize affordable housing. And by the way, you have to be flexible, because even if you have this large development, it might not be feasible, given the fluctuations in the housing market. It might not be feasible for the developer to provide all the amenities on the first year. It might take 2 economic cycles for these two. So it requires governments to really be understanding of those problems. Okay? Obviously, what we're getting, and I understand from Mary that you got some here also proposals of large islands. I've done the details, please. I'm not going to get into that one. But this is so it's common. It's actually everywhere you go, these developments have opposition on environmental grounds. So I think the way to go about this, and it's the right way, not only because it's politically expedient, but also it's the right way, is to make sure that these development rights come together with an exchange for rights in national parks or wilderness areas. So if I build 4 hectares here, I got to provide 16 hectares of environmentally protected land in an area that's contiguous to other environmentally protected land and where nature can actually thrive. Nature, I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry to break it to you guys, but nature doesn't thrive with you. Nature doesn't really want you there. Okay? Nature wants to be isolated. So you can exchange, and that's what they do in Florida. There's a wetland exchange fund where you can redevelop on wetlands next to cities and then create new wetlands away in areas that are contiguous to others, and that generates green. Okay, so I have minus 3 minutes to talk about the urban versus rural divide. Let me play a game. Anyone, please raise your hand if you really heard, but not in a just like superficial, you do know this place, Shantou. Please raise your hand. 0. Changchun. Ningbo. Shenyang. Anyone? Dongguan.
Are we stupid or is this
Well, hang on. I kind of know the answer. Chengdu.
Yes.
Okay. We got 6 hands on Chengdu. Well, let me break it to you. These are at least double the size of Copenhagen. All of them. In China, there's 50 cities that are at least double the size of Copenhagen. And that's who you're competing with, really. I mean, that's who you're competing with. The future, for good or for bad, does favor urban consumer amenities. We can build this, whatever, but if I want a personal service from my lawyer, I have to be in place. If I want a Tai Chi class, I have to be there, okay? And more money is devoted to these non-tradable goods. So cities are naturally good production places for this. We have these human capital spillovers because of technology. It's just we have to be together to understand, to explain to each other. We have an increasingly creative economy that's based on design. You're really good at it. And that combines with robotics, increased productivity, of search for increased productivity with less labor and with less environmental impact, so less goods. Which means that the cities that have all of this, and you have a great city that has all of this already, can compete with other global economic areas. Okay? That's the right way to build an economic foundation, because you are competing with these cities. Okay? So I'm always going to take a little bit of a pro-city stand, as you can see, because in a global competitive economy, you take your advantages. You don't take your weaknesses. Okay. Demographic context in the European Union, we see already population peaking, and it's going to start to decline. So what I'm really afraid, and I'm not sure about the discussion here, I really do not. Don't get me. I'm not trying to get into your own political discussions. But what I'm afraid, in some places, there might be an anti-city push. And that's actually very, very dangerous, because those are the places that are already saving many of those economies. So whereas, you can have pro-rural policies, you certainly don't want to have anti-city policies. Non-neutral policies that might disadvantage cities are already risky, because they risk challenging your own competitive ability around the world. Does this mean that we have to leave the rural world behind? Am I playing, again, the sort of the nasty sort of like role here? I do not think so. So how can we do pro-city policies but not anti-rural? I think the only answer to this is we can help rural areas, but not all rural areas. So I think the answer is targeting, sort of like maybe focusing on a few special rural development areas, keep that rural lifestyle alive and the culture alive, but perhaps not everywhere. It can't be, okay? So the idea, it's a little bit, now we have the cities, we don't allow them to expand because of the green concerns, but we have development at low densities and low productivity everywhere else. So how about letting the city expand, concentrating the services in a few rural development areas? By the way, this could be Ohio, this could be Kentucky. This is not about your country. It's really happening everywhere. It's really happening everywhere. So we can have this, we cannot save all of the American heartland. We just won't. But we can save a few places, maybe northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, and so on and so forth. And then, in exchange for that environmental impact, to really allow the nature to take back. That creates, and I say this, and it's important because one of the problems I think that we're having is that we have a lack of vision in the policy discussions. And we need to sell a vision for the future. I think that's a positive vision. You have, and it can garner a political consensus around it. Why? You have vibrant cities that are competing with those places you don't know, and they're producing technology, they're having young people have productive lives and meaningful lives. At the same time, you're still keeping those a few rural communities and the life in those rural communities, but at the same time, sort of to garner sort of a political coalition for that, you're creating a vision for the next 100 years. Maybe we're not going to get Denmark to the Paleolithic in some areas, but wouldn't it be a great inspiring vision to think of some lands that in 100 years, Nestle doesn't need to be right now, are going to go back to the wild, maybe 20% of the lands. Wouldn't that be a nice vision that galvanizes to the future? So with that, I'm very thankful for your invitation, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.